Okay, so we're in the second lesson with John Dominic Crossan and his moderator Trip Fuller as they go through lesson 2, which is on Matthew, the Matthew infancy narrative. And the title of it is The Continuity from Moses to Jesus is the byline for that. So let me go ahead and share our screen. Where is it? I think it's that one. Here. Yep. Okay. Here. And away we go.
Image. All right. It's visual class 2. I keep insisting on visual class, as you can see. Matthew 1 and 2. Here's the thesis, the proposal. Matthew 1 and 2 as a parabolic overture to Matthew. And there were some questions came in about that, and they were very good questions. Parabolic overture, both terms are equally important, but it's not enough, in other words, to show it's simply an overture. You could grant that and say, well, couldn't it be an historic overture? Of course it could. It could be. It could be. Historic overture would mean that we're getting information about what actually happened, about Herod and about the Magi and everything else, and their magic star, and all of that is intended to be factual. Now, a huge subtext today is the continuity from Moses to Jesus, from Old to New Testament, if you want to use the Christian terms. And I'm emphasizing that because next week it's going to be more about discontinuity. So then if we can move to the next image, and I'm going to inflict on you a little bit of important autobiographical trivia, possibly, but it really is connected with why this is not just an overture or an historical overture, but a parabolic overture. When I entered the Roman Catholic religious order, as you probably know, when I was 16 in 1950. So I got my name Dominic. It's not a legal name, it's a liturgical or a religious name. So I was ordained in 57, and my religious superiors, because I had 5 years of Greek, 5 years of Latin in a classical boarding school in Ireland, which kind of amazed them a bit, didn't amaze me at the time. I just thought that's what everyone did. They sent me back to Ireland, to Maynooth College, now National University of Ireland, part of it, in 57 to 59 to get a doctorate. Actually, it was a doctorate in theology, strictly speaking, the doctorate in divinity, because the Roman Catholic tradition likes Latin roots like divinity rather than Greek roots like theology. So for the 2 years there, I was at what's called the Dunboyne Institute, in that magnificent building. Look at the date over at the other side, 1796. This was built a couple of years after the French Revolution, so by the British government, by the way. British government financed this so that Irish students wouldn't go to Europe and get bad French ideas about freedom and equality and other such things. So they built this magnificent, kind of modeled on the Oxford and Cambridge quads edifice. Anyway, I got my doctorate there. And then immediately after that, my superiors, going to the next slide, they sent me to Rome for a 2-year postdoctoral specialization at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. You can see it there. It's in Piazza della Colata, just down the street from the Trevi Fountain, as it were, in from the Corso. And for 2 years there, this is when I learned what I'm going to be giving you today. This is when I had to do a thesis. I'd done my doctoral dissertation, but I had to do a thesis for the master's in biblical studies, a specialization. And I focused it on in Matthew 1 and 2, and how the infancy of Jesus was modeled by Matthew on the infancy of Moses. Now, that was an argument that it was an overture. And at the end, I'm going to come back to you why it was not advisable for me in the year 1961, the year before the Second Vatican Council began, at the Biblical Institute, to suggest, and I was far too smart to suggest, that it might have been a parabolic, which is a nice word for a fictional overture. I was fairly certain that would not get me, or would get me out of there a little faster than I needed to go. So hold on to that it's possible to hold on to Matthew 1 and 2 as an overture, but not necessarily as a parabolic overture. And so I want to be stressing that in this. Okay, now moving to the next image. Part one then, celebrating Matthew 1 and 2, this time in ivory. I did keep for continuity those lovely Catalan medallions for Matthew and Luke with Jesus trying to come out behind them, as it were. But the last time we were talking about stone and emphasizing the continuity for Gaudi in this masterpiece, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, that the infancy, Christianity, comes out of human evolution and is an organic part of it. Today I'm going to be looking at ivory, not stone, ivory. Next week we look actually at mosaic, but ivory this time. And if you go to the next image, please. Celebrating then with ivory. We're looking at a magnificent casket. I suppose it's about, maybe 2 feet wide, roughly. It's in the Farfa Abbey, north of Rome, made in 1060. Probably, I suspect, to keep relics within it. And if you look up at the lid, you can see the scenes on the lid, the Annunciation, the Visitation, the two women embracing one another, then the birth with Mary relaxing. And it always amuses me that in the Eastern image of the Nativity, Joseph is kind of sulking off in the corner. Yeah, he's not too sure about that. He's undergoing the Mediterranean male's horror story, being replaced by a god, being cuckolded by a god, as it were, about which he can't do anything but sulk. So basically, though, I want to celebrate the ivory. If you go to the next one, you'll be able to see the back of that. It's a magnificent artifact in the middle of the 11th century, as I said. And when Sarah and I were at the Abbey a couple of years ago, we thought we'd be glimpsing this, dimly through glass. And no, the Abbey brought it in, holding it in tissue paper into his study, put it on his desk and said, take all the time you want to look at it, examine it, photograph it, and I'll be back in about half an hour. So we had this priceless relics sitting right there for us. Now, moving from that to the next slide, and getting in to the more important thing we're going to be using today. They're called the Salerno ivories. If you can find them on the web, please do so. And if you ever find yourself south of Naples, do go to Salerno, because in the superb, and I'm underlining that, the superb Diocesan Museum, you wouldn't really think of even going there if you didn't know. The Diocesan Museum of St. Matthew, just beside the cathedral in Salerno, there are these magnificent series of ivories. And apart from them being magnificent, they're from ivory from Africa, because the people at Amalfi were trading with the Muslim people in Africa, and they brought ivory north to Amalfi, on that magnificent Amalfi Drive. And then they carved these Old Testament and New Testament. This is the second thing I want to say here. Here, it's an integration, not so much between evolution, as it were, and Christianity, but between Old and New Testament. And these scenes are simply taken in the museum. If you go to the next slide, you can begin to see what they were. Look over to the right, and you'll probably recognize what is behind me in my Overture background. The best reconstruction. I mean, they're all separated, and basically nobody knows what they were for. Were they intended to be put on a pulpit, intended to be put on a bishop's chair? The best explanation, and it's the one from that book by the late lamented, died in his 50s, Robert P. Bergman, published by Harvard in 1980, from the Salerno ivories. He reconstructs it as two doors. So imagine those on the right-hand side as twin doors, and they would have closed off the chancel, that's the choir. So they would have been behind the very old pulpits you can see on both sides there. They would close off the choir from the, shall I say, the population, the audience, and you would be seeing them mostly closed, mostly. So he imagines them around the rim of them. You would have a sort of a decoration with little medallions, but inside you have 20 on each door of these 10 inches by 5 inches plaques, and we call them plaques, with 2 scenes on each one. So you have 40 scenes to the left, 40 scenes to right, and the horizontal ones, you see at the top, the horizontal ones are the Old Testament, the vertical ones are the New Testament, and it's magnificently integrated. It's not as if there's this little prophecy and this little fulfillment. It's a complete integrated story from the beginning all the way through. And that's the 2 points I'm celebrating. First of all, the magnificence of the ivy. There's nothing like this collection from 1,000 years ago. This mini, all still there. Where you see gaps, that means that one has been lost, or it could be that some of them are preserved elsewhere. If you go to the next one, this is just to give you a close-up of what it would look like. On the left part of your screen, I'm showing the left door. So watch the integration. Across the top, running horizontally, I always think, you have the beginning of creation, the first 4 days of creation. And you see how they're doubled images, because each plaque obviously was big enough for 2 images, and you're not going to waste any ivory. So they get 2 images on each one. And if you're looking at the Genesis 1, so you have the spirit moving on the waters, and night and day looks light and night looks at Knox. And then the second one, you see
that's probably what's
God, who looks actually remarkably like Jesus, with a halo and everything. And he's creating the firmament, which means the angels. On the 3rd day, you have him creating the plants. Then on the 4th day, you have the sun and the moon. And that, of course, explains why you had to have the light and darkness before you could have sun and moon, because what counts in Genesis, as you know, this is an aside, is the week. The crown of creation is the Sabbath day. So everything has to work on a week because it has to get to the Sabbath. We are not, by the way, the crown of creation. We are the work of a late Friday afternoon, and best work is never done on a late Friday afternoon. So this would continue all the way across into the other door. Then moving down, you can see how I glossed over it. Yeah, let me hold this slide for a second here. The Annunciation and the Magi and the Star, they run on 2 levels, as you can see, but they're linked. The Annunciation led into the Visitation, led into, oh, take a look at this one, by the way. What's this one? Mary is telling Joseph. Mary is telling Joseph about the Annunciation. I presume, as we said the last time, it's good news and there's bad news. It's good news the Messiah is here, but it's not your son. And then the dream. So in this case, we clearly have the dream of Joseph telling him, the angel telling him, not to break up with Mary. And then down below in the next level, the Magi and their star is missing. And then Magi before Herod, telling him about, asking him about King of the Jews, and then giving their gifts. So this is what we'll be celebrating throughout this as the background. I think we can go probably now to the next one. Okay, now just to give you a little bigger image, mostly because this is magnificent work. It really is magnificent work. The Magi and the Star, as I said, is lost. So we can presume that, because these are typical series that are all over in the turn of the millennium. So talking to Herod and then giving their gifts. Then below, as we saw the dream, I've separated them, as you can see. So they're separate. Then the flight into Egypt, Mary with Jesus on the donkey, led by an angel, and then the slaughter of the innocents. And then moving to the next one. All right, so that's the celebration. If you want to celebrate Christmas, look at the Salerno ivories. And again, all of this is available on the web now. I mean, it's extraordinary. Almost anything is there if you get know enough information to go looking for it. So please look up the Salerno ivories if you want to see images to celebrate Christmas. Anyway, moving to our second section, question. There's going to be 5 main questions going to the first one. And some of these, you've sort of we glimpsed in our first lecture. But I want to focus these around 3 themes, just to focus. Marriage, the marriage question, the massacre, and the escape. Marriage, massacre, escape. Now, emphasizing, the questions about the marriage, they are literary questions about matter. They are not psychohistorical questions about Joseph's mind. It's not, what's Joseph thinking? Why did he think this? The question is, why did Matthew say it? So then moving to the first question. Why did Matthew, unlike Luke acts, so it's quite possible to do it differently, focus Jesus' infancy on Joseph, not Mary? Is it just raw, male superiority? Is that all that's going on? Why is Joseph so important and not Mary? Why does Joseph, for example, lead the whole story? Why, secondly, why would any writer place the conception by Mary before the Annunciation to Joseph? Is that a bad piece of writing? Couldn't he just have moved it up a bit? Because otherwise, what happens, of course, is he then raises the specter of adultery and divorce. And as we saw, the idea that Joseph would just put her away quietly in a small village, yet real, this finishes Mary's life for all practical purposes, even if nobody believes it, which is quite possible by Jewish law, that when an engaged male makes an accusation against his engaged wife-to-be, presumption of innocence is on her, not with him. Going to the next one, next question then. Hold on to these. Sorry, this is really more of this. Once you see this question, what it allows us to do, now we can move to the second one. It raises this whole issue of adultery and divorce. And then in the next slide, you can see what happens. So we'd be moving forward. What happens is this attack. And Matthew kind of lays out hostages to fortune. He invites this attack. So anyone who wants to oppose Christianity has only to kind of sneer, oh, so it was adultery after all. So it was adultery. After all, Joseph thought so. So in the middle of the 2nd century, you get the pagan Celsus using also opponents, Jewish opponents, who makes the accusation that the pregnant mother of Jesus was turned out of doors by the carpenter. That tells us it's Matthew, by the way. He's reading doors by the carpenter. Father is the carpenter. Joseph the carpenter, to whom she had been betrothed, as having been guilty of adultery. I kind of want to tear out your hair and say, Matthew, what did you do? And then even though Origen, 100 years later, kind of finesses it by saying, well, if you admit that it was adultery, at least it wasn't ordinary human marriage. I'm not certain that was Origen's most brilliant response. But in any case, moving to the next one. This explains Matthew's defense. This is why we find 5 women. We notice in a minute why these 5 keep coming up. Well, we have 5 women in an otherwise male genealogy, when male begets male. And all of a sudden, 5 women jump out at you. Tamar, who seduced Judah in Genesis. Rahab, the prostitute helper to the spies in Judges. Ruth, who seduced Boaz on the threshing floor in Ruth. And Bathsheba, who was raped by David. And Mary, suspected of adultery. So in the genealogy of Jesus, you have 5 women. What term do I use? Of suspect character or suspect character in the story? And that's why Matthew has to do this. Why in a totally patriarchal genealogy of male begetting male, these women jump out at you. 4 plus Mary, 5. So moving then to the next one. Those are questions about the marriage. Why did he raise all of this whole issue of divorce and possible divorce and adultery and all the rest of it? Now about the massacre. Again, these are literary questions about Matthew's text. They are not psychohistorical questions about Herod's mind. It's not an argument to say, well, Herod killed 3 of his own sons and 1 of his own wives, and Herod makes Henry VIII look monogamous and magnanimous. So that he would kill the kids, the young male children at Bethlehem was not surprising. Sure. We're not talking about historical questions about Herod. We're talking about literary questions about Matthew. So continuing the questions then. The next question, and this is the one that I think if you have a young child who's hearing the Christmas story and doesn't ask this, then it's a delayed arrival of the faculty of reason, I think, or else they're scared to ask questions about the Bible. Why did Matthew have the Magi? Oh, no, sorry, I'm wrong. I'm reading the wrong question. That's the next question. This one is, why the Magi and not the shepherds? Why the Magi and not the shepherds? Why not somebody else? And of course, what we're dealing with is, this is the wisdom of the East. It's a rather simple answer. You don't have to even wait for it. The wisdom of the East comes to replace what the royalty of the West has failed to do. Herod has failed, and the wisdom of the East comes. They're Magi. They're the priests from Babylon. So now the next question is the one that I was jumping to a bit too much. And this is the question. This is the obvious question. Look, they've got a magic star. And for this story, you believe in magic stars, and everyone in the first century believed in magic stars. The star of Venus had guided Aeneas all the way from Troy to found the Roman race in Italy, guided them across the Aegean to Italy. Now, actually, I should tell you, Venus Aphrodite was trying to guide Aeneas to Ireland, but they stopped off in Italy and blew the whole system. Anyway, here's the obvious question. Why did Matthew have this star-guided Magi, whose star could stop over a house and show them Bethlehem? Why did they have to stop off at Jerusalem to ask for directions? What's he up to? Now, as always, I'm never presuming, I may conclude, but I never presume that Matthew is just an incompetent writer. Out of respect for another writer, I don't presume that. I may conclude it, but it makes me think there's something really going on here that's very important. He has to get Herod into the story. The Magi can't just make a quick left turn and go down the Dead Sea. So then the fourth question. Why does Matthew have so many fivefold items? He's got 5 females. We just saw that, right? 5 females. And the whole story is guided by dreams. And there's 5 of them. Joseph is told to marry Mary. The Magi are told not to return to Herod. Joseph is told to flee to Egypt. Joseph is told to return to Israel. Look at this now. He's told to return to Israel and then to move to Galilee. You know, if you were being economic, you could say return to Galilee. But that would give you 4 dreams. So Matthew wants 5s, and then also, I put in that beautiful picture, by the way, the angel telling him to I think this is the later dream, of course, it's not the dream to marry Mary, it's I think to the dream to flee to Egypt. So, okay, moving to the next one, then the last and final question. And you have 5 prophecies. So you have 5 women, you have 5 dreams, and you have 5 prophecies. And when you look down through these prophecies, really, Matthew, dear, you're desperate. In plausibility, in credibility, they decline badly. By the time you get to the 5th one, Matthew, dear, you're just making it up. The first one isn't bad. If you're going to tell, you know, for example, the First World War, when it started, people kept saying, it'll be over by Christmas. Wars will always be over by Christmas. Well, in the ancient world, you couldn't say wars will be over by Christmas because you didn't have a Christmas. So you said, what? Wars will be over before a young woman, presumably a virgin who just got married, will bear her first son. 9 months, okay, by Christmas. 9 months is a good way to say by the end of the year. So Isaiah is simply reassuring the king that the invasion he fears will be over within 9 months. The Messiah from Bethlehem, well, that's a good one. That's a really, really good one. Return from Egypt? And the mourning for the children that were slaughtered at Bethlehem? Oh, that's pushing. And then that Jesus would be called a Nazarene? That just ain't there.
Well,
so
once again,
I'm not underlining incompetence.
the story.
I'm learning
Same
purpose. I'm underlining intention. He wants 5 prophecies and he's going to get them. And you're going to have them whether you like it or not. So now moving. That's the question. The final one is the escape. And by this time, you should almost know the answer. Again, we're not talking about historical questions. We're talking about literary questions. Why doesn't he have him escape over the Jordan into Moab, like in the book of Ruth? So if you turn to the next one. This is a final question. Why does Matthew have Jesus escape from Israel into Egypt? Hey, that's wrong direction. For the great escape is from Egypt into Israel. It's the Exodus from Egypt. Do you mean that now Israel under Rome appointed Herod the Great is Egypt? And you want to escape?
There's a lot. Well,
the opposite direction.
It's not that it is.
So this whole story is sort of climax. There's nowhere they could go except in the wrong direction, as it were, out of Israel into Egypt. They'll come back, of course, but that's the final point of the escape. So moving to the next image, we're now ready. Good, and pretty much on schedule. I'm keeping an eye on my time. We're now ready to slow down a bit and explain this.
And if you haven't figured out, these two,
and in one sense,
the one on the left,
we're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
They're
because anyone who's even
this is how
read Matthew and has some lights going on and say, young males are getting slaughtered in order to kill one male and the escape. Oh, that sounds like another story I heard somewhere else. So moving then to that other story. And the next slide then. All right, here's the thesis. The gospel according to Matthew proclaims the gospel. Let me imagine that the gospel is in front of you and there's no infancy. It starts at what we call chapter 3 and goes to chapter 28. Let's imagine Matthew has, as it were, finished his gospel and now he's ready to write his overture. The gospel, says Matthew to himself, proclaimed Jesus on the model of a new Moses. Let me emphasize that word. It's not new. We tend to think that new is good and the old stuff to the people is the old fuddy-duddy stuff. We want the new. The ancient world didn't think like that. If you were proclaiming the new, it would be far wiser to say it was the renewed. Caesar didn't have a new empire. He had a renewed republic. So new Moses means renewed Moses. Jesus is Moses turbocharged, as it were. That's why you do not think they've come to abolish, but to fulfill. So Moses, as everyone knew, had 5 books, Pentateuch, read 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Matthew is going to have not 5 books, but 5 discourses. There'll be the first one. This is where it's really proclaimed on what we call the Sermon on the Mount, the worst title ever given to anything ever in the history of ever. It's not the Sermon on the Mount as if Jesus was up there lacking a megaphone. It's the new law from the new Mount Sinai by the new Moses. And then you have the mission discourse, the parables discourse, community discourse, and the grand finale, eschatological discourse. So Matthew sort of sets up his gospel in a five-fold mini books. And then, of course, moving to the next slide, that means that, therefore, here's my thesis. The infancy overture for Jesus in Matthew 1 and 2, with its three main themes, marriage, massacre, escape, is deliberately modeled on the infancy overture for Moses, Exodus 1 to 2, with its three themes, the order now changes, massacre, marriage, and escape. But now, something really important has to be added. Because, if you read the story in in Exodus 1 and 2, it's kind of brief on what's going on. Yeah, the finding in the bulrushes is a marvelous story, and bringing in Pharaoh's daughters is a marvelous idea. But, you need a few more expansion. And so we bring in Midrash. Midrash. Don't get lost with Midrash. I don't like the word. It sounds like some kind of a disease, actually. It's simply, here's what's going on. If you're a storyteller in the first century, if you're a storyteller, and you're used to telling, say, the story of Exodus, and you find out that people raise their hands, but they're not polite like you, and wait till the end of the lecture to ask questions, they interrupt and say, wait a minute, why? So as you tell the story, you incorporate into it expansions, glosses, but always with the intention of expanding it, giving more lessons. For example, supposing you're telling the story of the birth of Moses, and somebody raised their hand, excuse me, Rabbi, got a question. Isn't it weird that God just had Moses born in the middle of a massacre? Isn't that kind of bad transcendental timing? Couldn't God have got Moses born a little before or a little after the general massacre? Isn't that bad timing? So we better explain what God is up to. Another question. Rabbi, another question. I don't understand how the Jewish parents, knowing that if it was a male child would be slaughtered, why would they go ahead and keep having intercourse? Why wouldn't they divorce or separate from one another? So those are the questions, precisely the questions about massacre and marriage that are going to be answered in the Midrash that we have from the first century. We have examples from the first century, and they will be modeling then what happens to Jesus. And all of a sudden we begin to see why Matthew has to raise this question of separation, and there has to be a massacre. So moving to the next one. All right, let me take you to this image on the western wall of the Dura Europa synagogue in Syria. It has been completely reconstructed in a separate building in the Damascus Museum. When Sarah and I were there a couple of years ago, 2010, the last year, could get into Damascus safely without a security vest. It was closed for renovations. My suspicion was it was probably just as well keep it closed just for safety in case of any vandalism. But before you were able to go in, and down in the bottom of the corner there on the right hand, I can see it here. I'm using my cursor to show it.
He thinks we can see his cursor. We can't.
That's going to be the image you'll see in the next one. All right, now reading from right to left. We're reading as if we were reading Hebrew. We're seeing an image, of course, but reading from right to left. The first image there is the massacre. The triple plot, first of all, work the people to death. Isn't that a horrible antitype? Work the people to death, the Jewish people to death, then have the Jewish midwives kill the male children. They refuse to do that bravely. And then eventually have them drowned by the Egyptian people. So that's the triple plot for the massacre. Then that moves to the second thing. You can see the woman who's bending down there is Jochebed, the mother of uh, Moses. She's putting it into the Nile for safety in the wicker basket. The midwives are standing above her because they're the same people on the extreme left. You can see the daughter of Pharaoh finds him in the river, takes him out of the little basket, and she's shown nude actually, even though it slightly later was kind of expunged slightly, but she's going into the water, of course, so she is nude, and then the child is given to the midwives on the extreme left. That's the scenario we're working with. And then here's the questions. So first question and the next slide. How do I know these questions? Because they don't come up in the Exodus account, but they come up in the Midrashim. Question. Asked in the biblical Haggadic or narrative midrash. There's also the halakhic or the legal midrash. Storytellers wouldn't be touching that. That's more for experts. But narrative midrash, any good storyteller could make it up and to get it written down, you have. So the first question about the massacre. Why did God have Moses born amid a general massacre? Yeah. Isn't that tacky timing at least? And then in the next slide, you get the answer to that. And I know it's the answer because it's found in the Midrash. Oops. Isn't that again? No matter how often I go over this, there'll always be a typo the last time around. The massacre, massacre, sounds like an insurance program, massacre. The massacre was a particular one against Moses as the predestined child. So he just didn't happen to get born when the massacre was going on. But he was the predestined child, and the massacre was to get him. Now you see the much closer echoes now to the Pharaoh account and the Herod accounts. So let me look at the text. Going to the next one. All right. This is Joseph's Jewish Antiquities. And it's important that we have it from the first century, though my suspicion is this story was around much more fully, much earlier. We simply have two sources from the first century. This one explains the massacre as intended to get the predestined child, not named Moses, of course. Here's a text. One of the sacred scribes, person with considerable skill in accurately predicting the future, announced to the king, this is the Pharaoh, that there would be born to the Israelites at that time one who would abase the sovereignty of the Egyptians and exalt the Israelites. Were he reared to maturity and would surpass all men in virtue and win everlasting renown. This is Josephus describing Moses, of course. Alarmed thereat, the king, on this sage's advice, ordered that every male child born to the Israelites should be destroyed by being cast into the river. That's the third minute. Now, I'm sure you're hearing the echoes, so I won't beat you to death with them. But this is the detailed background of why Moses doesn't just happen to get born in a massacre. The massacre is to try and stop the predestined child from overwhelming Egypt. Rather. So if you move now to the next one.
I will add when we read scripture.
So now
that's what I
probably
that's
don't
what I
have to
base
use
all my.
May I ask Herod about the king of the Jews?
If you read the Exodus account, why did Pharaoh?
Jews? So this is exactly
What
the
was the reasoning in scripture?
the sages then announced face of the predestined
because the Israelites were getting too hot.
as Jerusalem is frightened,
too many of them.
all the chief priests tell Bethlehem of Judah. Then the ruler,
He's giving an alternative story from
after they
Josephus,
take off and don't come back and tell us.
who wrote after
Herod saw he'd be tricked by the wise men, infuriated, killed all the children, all the male children, in and around Bethlehem, were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. So we're now tracking much more closely with the Exodus Midrashim. And if you want to move to the next one, please do. All right, back now to the second question. Remember, the first question had to do with the massacre and had to do with why did Moses get born during a massacre, and we find out the answer in order to get him. Now we're looking at the next scene, actually, and that almost magnificent comic strip on the wall. You're panning to the left. Moses' mother Jochebed puts the child in the river. But the question was this: why did Amram and Jochebed, their names are given, not separate at least, or divorce, or whatever term you want to use, to avoid chance of a murdered male child? Wouldn't surely they all have stopped? And again, now this is this is what inquiring minds ask of the text, and what the Haggadic narrative midrash answered as we move to the next one. Now I'm quoting. This is from a book scholars call Pseudo-Philo. There's obviously no person called Pseudo-Philo. That simply means it's anonymous. We don't know who it was, and used to be attributed to Philo, and so it's now called Pseudo-Philo. It's a book of biblical antiquities. What it's doing, somewhat like the Jewish antiquities of Josephus, it's retelling the biblical story with all sorts of glosses and expansions in the text itself. And these reflect, as we said, the uh, oral comments from the storytellers. The image I gave you is magnificent one of Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the law from the hand of God coming down from the cloud. And this is, of course, one of the Salerno ivories. All right, here's the text. The elders of the people decree, a man should not approach his wife. General divorce. In other words, the obvious question. They decide not to have any intercourse, any marital intercourse, because they won't produce children, at least not even risk female children, male children. Then Amram, the father, says, I will not abide by what you decree. I will go and take my wife. I will not consent to the command of the king. And if it is right in your eyes, let us all act in this way. So in this case, he refuses to go along with any general divorce. God said, because Amram's plan is pleasing to me, he's rewarded. He who will be born of him will serve me forever. Because he trusts in God, he has faith in God, that somehow it will be all right. And I will reveal to him my law. There's also a second account of this in here. It's actually a separate one. The Spirit of God came upon Miriam, elder sister of Moses, who was a prophetess, one night, and she saw a dream. A man said, go and say to your parents, he who will be born from you will save my people. At this point, actually, the midrashim tend to multiply. I just use this one. But the fuller story also says that Joseph, in one version, Amram is going to go along with the general decree. He said, all right, I will separate from Jochebed, no more children. And then it's in a dream. A dream. God comes to Miriam in a dream, and she tells him, in other words, go back and to your wife, because the child to be born is the predestined child. So they managed somehow in these expansions to answer the two major questions. And one final point. If you take this whole story, the whole story with other midrashim that are harder to date to the first century, but my suspicion is we're there already. The fuller story goes like this. Pharaoh had guess what? A dream. Just like in the first chapters of Daniel. He has a dream. In this dream, he sees a scale. And in the scale, on one side, there is a young lamb, and on the other side of the scale is all of Egypt. And the lamb goes down, and Egypt goes up. The lamb totally outweighs Egypt. Then, next day, he calls together all his wise men, just closer to the herd with his wise men, and said, what's the meaning of this dream? And then they tell him. the predestined child, sorry, there is a predestined child to be born to the Israelites, the Hebrews, who will outweigh all of Egypt. I will exalt the Israelites to the skies. And so the massacre is decreed, and so Moses is born, and so Moses escapes. So moving to the next one. So again, I don't want to pound you over the head by this, you probably got it clear. If you think of the themes as marriage, massacre, and escape, the problem over there with the Midrashim about Moses is the male child massacre. Amram, unlike others, at least in the text that we have, written text, refuses to separate, rewarded by having Moses as his child. Or he is warned about Moses by Mary. That over the other one, now we begin to see why Joseph has to do, Matthew has to do with this. There has to be a possibility of a divorce and a separation. There has to be a dream. And in that dream, Joseph has to be told, like Amram, go ahead with the marriage at least. The child is the predestined child. Once again, the massacre again. On one side, the evil ruler is Pharaoh, warned by sages of the predestined child, decrees male child murder. Over now, evil ruler is Herod. Pause for a second. That's a ferocious state, political state. Herod is the Rome-appointed king of the Jews. We saw that possibly in the last one. Anthony and Octavian have brought him into the Senate, declared him officially king of the Jews. That's his title. And then taken him up to the Capitoline temple of Jupiter for sacrifice and sent him home in the 30s to be king of the Jews. Any suggestion of somebody else as king of the Jews is treason. So the Magi are actually committing politely treason by suggesting there's somebody else who's king of the Jews and nothing to do with Rome's approval. And then the escape, of course, the huge escape. There's the minor, I shouldn't say minor, but there's the first escape, of course, of Moses from being put to death by being taken care of by Pharaoh's daughter, which is a rather lovely story, actually. And then, of course, eventually Moses escapes from Egypt to Israel, as everyone knows. And then now the terrible, tragic irony is that now the only place Jesus can escape is from Israel to Egypt. Not because Israel has become Egypt, but because Israel under Herod, under the Rome-appointed Herod is Pharaoh. He's turning Israel into Egypt. Then we go to the next one as we are winding down. All right, now let me come back to, this is just there to remind me to come back to the great someone. Remember what I said that I did my doctoral dissertation, my thesis in 1961. In 1961, the Biblical Institute in Rome. Now that was the year before the Second Vatican Council started. It was a magnificent years to be in Rome. Oh, was it exciting! Anyway, I gave that whole argument. I gave pretty much everything there, except I did all the text and everything, fully text, and made the argument that Matthew 1 and 2 was a carefully calculated overture for Matthew 3 to 28. Now, my three professors, major professors that year, one was Augustine Bea. He was made a cardinal and put in charge by John the 23rd of Jewish Christian or Jewish Catholic relations in the Second Vatican Council. He was fine. He was fine. So, insofar as I was talking about the Jewish scriptures leading into the Christian scriptures, modeling them and everything else, oh, I was right with the program. That's why I first got interested in all of this. But two of my other professors, Stanislas Lyonnais, French, and Maximilian Zerwig, German, I graduated in June of 61. In September of 61, they were forbidden to teach in the year 61 to 62. They were put back in by the council. So when I did this and wrote my thesis, I was very much aware that no, I don't know if I would have used the word parabolic. I might just have said fictional. I might just have said maybe Matthew made it up, which is exactly what I think he did. Matthew made it up, but he made it up on the modeling, of course, of the Midrashim, which had been made up
Obviously, I don't agree with
themselves to answer other questions.
giving y'all heads
But
up.
I was quite aware that if I wanted to graduate, which I rather did after 2 years in Rome, and I was still under a vow of obedience and an order, it would not be wise to say that this was parabolic or fictional. I better leave it kind of open whether Matthew had done huge research, all sorts of information about the birth of Jesus, and sort of, I didn't say this, carefully picked out what would suit. Because the way I had to do it was the double negative. It is not impossible that. And not impossible that is not an historical statement. It's how you dance through a minefield of dogma. It's not impossible that, because all things are not impossible that. So I am arguing that it is parabolic because it is an overture for sure. But then when I turned to Luke, I found exactly the same process that we will next week. Luke doing the same thing for his Luke Acts. He's going to do the same thing. Now, maybe they both had a huge reservoir and each chose different materials. Each chose different materials. Matthew to suit Matthew, Luke to suit Luke, and they were all historical. But then, isn't it strange with all that data on the first years of Jesus, his infancy, that you don't have a clue about anything, that maybe if you want to say Luke, when Jesus is 12 in the temple, there's a huge vacuum until he's 30. But that's kind of hard to believe. So I am convinced completely that the honest answer, unless you're doing apologetics, I'm doing research. If you want to do apologetics, you say it's not impossible. But I consider them parabolic. Finally, I'm going to be quite blunt. What's wrong with parables? When Jesus wanted to say something important about the kingdom of God, he didn't give a sermon. He didn't even give a lecture that I'm doing. He told a story, a parable. Now, you could argue if you wanted to be really, really strange, that the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, they all actually happened, and Jesus knew about them in local gossip or familiar, and he just turned them into a parable by saying, go and do likewise. That's doing apologetics. There are scholars who do apologetics. I do research. And I'm going to say what I think is what Matthew intended and what Luke intended. And I think they were intended and written as parabolic, not historical overture. And I suppose I would have to say, if we don't like that, take it up with Jesus, who started this bad habit of making up stories, and then with Matthew, who followed it. And that'll get us ready for Luke next week. All right.
Okay.
I think I am.
So, couple of things before we get out of here. Turn the light on. Obviously, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he has some nice points. That's kind of why I wanted us to listen to his lectures, these 4 lectures that he had. The idea, what he's mainly positing is that in Matthew and Luke, and specifically we're in Matthew today, the infancy stories of Jesus in Matthew are a parable overture. That's what parabolic means, is parable. That if you follow the story of from Matthew 1 through 2, that infancy narrative, that you can apply that as like a pre-writing outline for the rest of the story. And so when Jesus flees to Egypt, that can be a parable relating to Jesus ascending into heaven after his resurrection. And that coming back from Egypt will be his second coming. That's what he's getting at, even though he said the word eschatological earlier, and that's what that means. So uh, he I don't think Matthew wrote the whole story and then put all that in there at the beginning. I think that there's this idea of fact and truth, and I use the example of a person going into a convenience store to rob it. There's three other people in the store. After the robbery has happened, the guy takes off. When the police arrive, they ask for a description of the robber, and you get three or four different, you get the three people that are in there giving a slightly different description. Are they telling the truth? Absolutely. Are they all factual? Not necessarily. And so when we hear stories of Matthew and Luke and how they differ in things, you're getting this same kind of story. You're getting a description of what you saw. It's truth. There may be some little details of fact that are miscued, but that's where I disagree. I don't think they were made up. I think they were just conveyed and he wrote them down. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that. So any questions? Next week, it's going to be on Luke. So we get to hear him again. Hopefully it won't be as droning. Today was a little boring with him. Last week was pretty good. This week was a little boring. So any questions? No?
It sounded like he was doing this for seminary students.
Well, yes, he is very intellectual. And okay,